Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Pami Sachdeva, and I'm the chair of the ICD board. I'm pleased to welcome you to this event. I also want to thank Reverend Shelley Poe, over here, a member of our board and our wonderful staff who are sitting at the back, for hosting us here and for helping to make arrangements for this event. Shelley has also kindly agreed to manage the question and answer session during today's formal presentation. As many of you know, ICD is a network of faith-based and associated organizations dedicated to promoting mutual understanding and positive relationships among diverse people in Fairfax County. We do this through education, engagement, and support. And ICD was founded 20 years ago by representatives of the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim faiths. And I want to especially recognize Marie Monson, who's sitting here. She's the original founder of ICD 20 years ago, and we were expecting one other person, Mogita, to come, but she may turn up later on. So Marie, you'll be happy to see that we've continued all the work that you started, and she's serving on the ICD board as the vice chair and the chair emeritus. Since then, our membership has steadily grown, and we now have 14 organizations in ICD representing 6 faiths, including the 3 originals, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, plus we've added 6 Hindus and Baha'is. We promote inclusiveness, integrity, respect, and trust of all people, and we stand in solidarity with one another. The brochure that you received when you checked in provides more information about ICD, and I encourage you to explore our website and see the videos of our previous programs as well. To get us started, I'll invite Judith Samir, an ICD board member and our education committee chair, to introduce the speaker and to give you a quick overview of the program. So welcome again, and thank you for coming.
Thanks, Pami. And thank you to everyone for participating today. Today represents the first of a 2-part program that we're calling Welcoming the Stranger, the Challenge of Embracing Immigrants. When we asked participants in previous dialogues to suggest topics that would interest them, one of the ideas cited most frequently was immigration. Last summer, as we were shaping our plans for this year's programs, members of our board agreed that the topic was timely. I don't think we fully recognized just how timely or how hot it would be in the context of this year's elections. Whatever each of us may feel about the outcome of the election, there can be no doubt that immigration policy questions will be in the spotlight and that they will continue to generate often personal and even emotional responses. Our goal today is to learn about U.S. immigration, its history and policy evolution, types of immigrant status, and some common fears and perceptions about immigrants. In our discussion groups, we'll have an opportunity to continue learning from one another, to share our personal or family immigration experiences, to explore our perspectives on why immigration continues to be such a difficult issue, and to discuss in this safe and open environment the topic of the day, which is immigrants in America, benefit or burden. Before introducing today's speaker, I will just remind you that the second program, to be held next Sunday at the same time and place, will focus on the immigrant population in Fairfax County, including some demographics, the challenges of that immigrants face, their achievements, the resources available to help them become successful and valued members of the community. Representatives of some of the organizational resources will host tables where they can provide specific information for those seeking assistance and those seeking to be part of the solution. You can still register for that program if you haven't done so already. So let's jump in. Our speaker today is Michael Heffer. He was formerly the director of the Office of Immigration Statistics in the Department of Homeland Security, and he now serves as vice chair of Virginia's Office of New Americans Advisory Board. I know that he will tell you a little bit more about himself, so I won't steal his thunder. But I can tell you that he has a wealth of knowledge to share on today's topic, and I'm really excited to learn from him. We'll have some time for questions at the end of his presentation, so please join me now in welcoming Mike Heffer.
Thank you, Judith. It's great to be here. I know this organization, and I see a lot of familiar faces out there. And again, just happy to be here and talk about this topic. And as Judith said, I'm a demographer, statistician, and I've been working in immigration for about 35 years. And I've worked in immigration policy offices for about that time, too. And I think that in the United States, we're rightfully proud of our immigrant history, but it's always been a struggle, as you're starting to learn today. And you can count the numbers of times that we've had major immigration reform on your hand. It's probably less than 5, maybe 5. And one of those times was 1986 under Ronald Reagan, where we had a program of legalization and some enforced against illegal immigration, trying to stop illegal immigration. And it was called amnesty by some or legalization by others. And then in 1990, there was reform on legal immigration. And one of the things that's so difficult for our leaders to make changes in immigration, that they said, well, let's have an independent panel to give us recommendations, and maybe that'll make it easier. And I was able to be on that, I was a staff member to the Commission on Immigration Reform in the early 1990s. And they made recommendations, and they weren't passed. And then I was on the Bush team that was trying to pass immigration reform in 2010. Was not successful. I was on the Obama team in 2013, not successful. I think there were a few others, so it wasn't just me, you know. But the point is that we have not had immigration reform, major immigration reform, since 1990. And you'll hear a lot of pundits and politicians on both sides of the aisle say our immigration system is broken. And part of the reason for that is that we have not kept up with the times. So anyway, I have two caveats before I get started. Immigration laws are complex, and one thing I've learned is there's an exception to every rule. Okay, so please appreciate that I'm going to be talking in generalities and try to do the best I can. And as Judith sort of alluded to, we prepared this presentation months ago, and we didn't anticipate the president's election. And while I touch on topics, I don't directly address that, but we can discuss those in discussions. And I think I'm going to be here afterwards too, right? And I can answer questions after the meeting. So let's jump into it here. Okay, just outline again what we're going to be doing. I'm going to have 4 sections. I know some of you may not be able to read that, but I hope you have your handouts and you can follow along. So I'm going to talk about demographic history and numbers, but I'll touch on some immigration policies. Then we'll discuss major immigration types and some of our historical legal immigration priorities. And finally, we'll discuss the keys and misunderstandings about immigration. But first, I am a statistician, and I want to have you all participate in a survey with me. And so we're going to learn our collective immigration histories. Okay. I want to raise your hand if you are an immigrant yourself. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm not going to count every time, but we have about 7 out of 80. Well, in the United States, 1 out of every 7 residents are immigrants. Within Fairfax County, 3 of 10. And the United States, we're 5% of the world's population, yet we have 20% of the immigrants in the whole world. So we're unique in the number of immigrants that we have, and this is our tradition. Okay. Next. So the people who raise their hand to be immigrants, you keep raising your hand, but how many are either immigrants or have immigrant ancestors that you know of? Okay. Let's ask, is there anybody here who doesn't have an immigrant ancestor or not an immigrant themselves? Okay, none. So we're a nation of immigrants. Only 1% of the population is either American Indian or native to Alaska. Okay. How many of you were born to an immigrant parent? Okay, about 5 of you. Well, I don't want to flatter you, but you're a member of an exceptional cohort. The children of immigrants perform the best economically of any cohort ever, more than native born. How many, raise your hand if you have ancestors that immigrated before 1920? Many of you. Congratulations, your ancestors entered the right way. But that's not saying much. Before 1920, there was really no limitations to immigration. There were some that I'll talk about, but there was no right way. There wasn't even a border patrol until 1924. There wasn't an immigration service till 1890. We only started collecting statistics in 1820 because people were dying coming across on steamships, and that was where we get our numbers from. So you'll see later I talk about it in 1820. Okay, next. How many had ancestors that came from 1920 on? A few of you, okay. All right, well, they may have had to wait to come to the United States. Somebody might have had to look at papers, they would have had to apply. And I don't know if anybody had somebody who came illegally, but I did. My grandfather was from Quebec, and he was living near the border, but he just walked across. We have a border with Canada, 5,500 miles, basically open. Still do, really. I mean, there's people at ports of entry, and we do have a border patrol, but it's mostly on the southern border. He later came back the right way. Okay. And how many of you have ancestors who came here because they were fleeing persecution? Okay. I think one of the things that the United States is very proud of is that we're a safe haven. We're seen as a safe haven for immigrants. And this is something, too, where the faith communities have responded, and they sponsor refugees. And this is a chart that shows the annual number of refugees that are coming in since 1946, where we officially started collecting it. And over the course of this time, it's about 6.5 million refugees. In the 2010s, we were averaging about 138,000 a year. And in 2021 on, it's about 80,000. Part of that's due to the pandemic. But my wife's favorite organization is HIAS. So but also we've had Church World Service, the Lutheran Refugee Service, Catholic services that are all part of this. And it's something that I've sponsored refugees, and I'm very proud of that. And it's been a wonderful thing for me. So, getting into numbers. So I just met a friend back from the Census Bureau, and what we're showing here is Census Bureau data. This is data basically from the annual censuses, and it's showing the number in millions of immigrants in the United States. And you see this huge, huge increase beginning in 1980. It's a pretty rapid change. It's really unprecedented in our history. And you'll also see later that these immigrants are coming from different areas than they were before. And the growth was really fueled by the Immigration Act of 1965, which eliminated national origin quotas, and also illegal entries played a part. Okay, as I said, that 50 million that are in the United States right now, that's the most of any country in the world. But for a little different perspective, the line is showing the per capita or percent of residents that are foreign-born. Okay, by foreign-born, I mean anybody that was just born outside the United States. So we're approaching where we had been at the turn of the century, and back in 1900, 1910, but we're just approaching it. So we're not really in a unique, in terms of our history. We're reaching that now in terms of percentage. And I mentioned U.S. has the most immigrants, but we are not the country with the most immigrants per capita. Australia has 30%, New Zealand 28%, Canada 23%, and there's a bunch of countries in Europe that have more as a percentage. So that was data from the census. Now this is my old job. We collected data on the number of legal immigrants coming in to the country. And again, we started in 1820, and that was basically on steamships. We had no immigration service. So for you statisticians out there, it was probably undercount back then. There's no border, there was no people at the border, so people could walk in. But it's pretty clear here. This also doesn't include, obviously, undocumented immigration. And what you see here is really two staircases, really. And we see this increase from 1820 on, peaking in about the 1900s, and then going down. And then during the Great Depression and World War II, there's hardly any, probably more immigrants left than came in. Okay, we don't do a very good job. In the United States, we don't track immigration. We don't track how many people come and then leave. But historically, we thought it's about 30%. I don't think it's that high now, but we just don't have any data on that. We'll also see this other wave that starts around 1960, 1970, going up, and we're getting about 1 million immigrants a year. So 1 million legal immigrants a year. So we've always struggled with immigration. Even during the period of the 19th century where the American creed was for growth and westward expansion, what we see in the 1820s and 1830s, that's mostly Irish and German immigrants. And I have something that's in your sheet. If you can't read it up here, I just want you to take a look at it. This is from Samuel Morse, Yale graduate, inventor, painter, and I'll let you read what he said about specifically Catholic immigration. So it's I think I heard some language that was similar in past year. Question? Okay, going back, we also saw a more formal and organized anti-Catholic with efforts with the Know Nothing Party that came in about 1850. They were worried about Irish immigration and voting. They were afraid that they were being organized to vote, and they would vote a certain way. Then our first really specific policy of national origins was banning Chinese contract workers in 1882. It's the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the feeling was, and it probably was true, that they were taking jobs and they were accepting low pay and taking jobs away from U.S. natives. And racial animus also probably had a role. So then we started getting qualitative bans on immigration. In 1875, prostitutes and convicts were barred entry. And in 1882, those convicted of political offenses and excuse my language here, but this is what it says in the law, lunatics and idiots, and persons likely to become above charge were prohibited. Polygamists in 1903. So those were sort of the bars we had leading up to 1920s. And you can see the huge increases that we're getting in the late 1880s, 1900s. And this was mostly fueled by immigrants from Russia and Italy. And these new immigrants were thought to be inferior and radicals. So even back then, we set up a commission. It was called the Dillingham Commission in 1910, and there were some very good researchers on there. But one of the things they did is they used phrenology. And they looked at immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, and they looked at the shape of their heads, and they came to the conclusion that Southern and Eastern Europeans were a serious threat to the American society and culture and should be greatly reduced, and that we should continue restrictions on China, Japan, and Korea. So in 1920 and 2021 and 24, the Quota Act of 1921 and 24 was passed, and we effectively reduced immigration to about 358,000 and nearly banned all immigration from Asia. As I mentioned, after that, we had World War II, and then we saw steady increases. Okay, I've called these waves, wave 1 and wave 2, so remember those. Okay, this chart is going to show in the different waves what percent are from, of the legal immigrants are from certain continents and areas. So the first, this is from 1820 to 1879. You can see that its majority is Northern and Western Europe. So 1880 to 1929, this is where we see the shift. So now we see Southern and Eastern Europeans coming in. And this was the Russians and Italians that I was talking about. 1930 to 69, when there's very few immigrants coming in, you can see now that the Western Hemisphere is showing up. And this is primarily from Cuba, Canada, and Mexico. And then in the period from 1970 to the current, you can see a rapid change here. Almost half of all immigrants that we've ever recorded entering came in this last period that's in yellow. And you see now that Asia accounts for 35% of immigrants, whereas they had been banned previously. Things opened up under the Immigration Act of 1965, and this increased. One of the things that I've heard leading up to this, there was a lot, of course, immigration was in the news, so I heard a lot of stories about this, and there was talking about the Immigration Act of 1965. That eliminated, it was done in the spirit of the Civil Rights Movement, it eliminated the national origin quotas. And it also, actually for the first time, put a limit on Western Hemisphere immigration. And the thought was that, well, this isn't going to change immigration at all, because, as we'll learn later, most of our legal immigration is based on family reunification. So the only people that are going to be coming in would be the family of the people that have already been here. So it would continue to be Northern and Western European. Well, it didn't, for various reasons. Okay, next I'm going to turn to the types of immigrants. So the first one I've been talking about is foreign-born, 48 million in the United States. You can really divide them into two groups, overall groups. Undocumented, these are persons here without documents authorizing their right in the United States. And how do they get here? Well, they come either two ways. They come across the borders, elude the Border Patrol, and they make it into the United States successfully. But there's not good data on this, but perhaps 40% of the people that are here are coming with a visa, and then they overstay their terms, or they begin working or doing something they shouldn't do. I think Elon Musk came up as part of this, would be an example. So we have undocumented and we have legal, and there's many legal immigrant groups. But what I'm going to talk about those that are here permanently and those that are here temporarily. So these are people that we've officially allowed in the United States. And what happens is, though, that people can change from these groups. You can be undocumented, and then you can become temporary or permanent. Or of the permanent immigrants that we get every year, half of them are already here in the United States. So they're converting from temporary to permanent. Okay. The first one, I'm calling it, this is the term that we use in the Immigration Service, lawful permanent resident. This is what you probably know as a green card holder or just an immigrant. These are people that are allowed to enter and stay permanently in the United States. And then about 80% of those people become a naturalized citizen. So these are people now they're eligible to vote. Another permanent category, and this is a quirk of our immigration laws, people who come as refugees who are gaining asylum status have to wait a year before they can apply to become a permanent resident. I don't know why we do that, but that's just the way it is. And the difference between a refugee and an asylee, each of them, if they gain that status, are fleeing persecution. Okay? But a refugee is somebody who's outside the United States, and an asylee is somebody who's inside the United States. So temporary. We have temporary visitors, and this is a large group. It's persons lawfully admitted for a temporary period of time or to complete their course of study. So examples would be tourists. So it's about 200 million people enter the United States each year under these categories, and many of them just come and leave. They go to Disney World and then they go back. They go to visit Niagara Falls and go back. So we have a lot of people, and they stay a short period of time. But we do have other groups. I mentioned students. So students come to the United States, study, and they can be here for their course of study, and actually they can stay even a little bit longer. We have the high-tech workers. Some of you may have heard of H-1B category. These are people coming, and many of them are working in the software industry. And there are probably, at any point in time, about 500,000 of those people in the United States. And seasonal agricultural workers, there's something like 30 categories. So the next three categories I'm going to talk about are all temporary, but they're a little more controversial, okay? The first one is temporary protective status. So this was added by the 1990 Act, and I think the United States is pretty unique in having a category like this. And what it does is allows people who are either countries involved in armed conflicts or they have an environmental disaster or other extraordinary event to stay in the United States temporarily. And in some cases, this works as intended. And in some cases it doesn't, because we've had, it's misleading. It says temporary there, but we've had people from El Salvador that have been in the United States since the early 1990s under this category. So it's not really temporary, and it could be misused. But it also works as intended. I think an example would be from West Africa when the Ebola breakout was going on. West Africans were allowed to stay in the United States. When the pandemic was over, they left. And so there's many examples where it works, but I think another thing that I'll just say is that I'm going to talk about the people in Springfield, the Haitians in Springfield. Many of them are here under temporary protective status, and some people say that's not legal status, but it is. If you're here under TPS, it is a legal temporary status, but it's not permanent. They have to apply every 2 years. So I think another category you may have heard of is DACA or Dreamers. These are people, children who, I have the data on this, they usually came when they were 3 years old. They came, we educated them. They're 20 years old, 16, 20 years old, and they, under Obama, did an executive order and allowed them to stay in the United States. It was controversial because it was an executive order. They were coming from an unauthorized status. So it's in the news whether it should stay or whether they should get rid of this. And the people that applied for this were in a precarious position because they gave, part of the application said, we're not going to share this with the enforcement authorities. So they gave us their addresses, and so we have those on record, and they're in just a very precarious position. And the question is whether it will continue. Personally, I don't see why we can't get together and allow these children, U.S. children, never been in their country, to stay here. I would hope maybe this group we can work on that. And the next category is parolees. And I had a question about what's parolee? Well, these are people that are paroled into the United States for a temporary period. And it's a discretionary by the executive to allow people in. And I think when people were getting out of Afghanistan, many of them came as a parolee. And so they're here in the United States, but there's no way for them to get permanent status. So something's going to have to be done to allow them to stay permanently. When the fall of in Vietnam, we basically paroled people into to the United States, and we had to later pass a law to allow them to stay here permanently. And Congress gets upset with this because it's sort of the executive branch is letting people in, and they don't have complete control over it. Okay, I know you can't see that, so look at your handout, and I hope you can read that. So on the left, the one thing that I forgot to mention is in the census, it doesn't ask how many people, it asks whether you're foreign born. It doesn't say how many of you are here without authorization. It doesn't say how many of you are here legally. It doesn't say that. So what we have to do is make estimates of how many are here. And these happen to be coming from Pew Research Center. And this is going back in time, it's 2022, and it's about 48 million people. And you can see about half of the foreign-born population are not here as naturalized citizens. They're showing 24% are here as lawful permanent residents, meaning immigrants, and they haven't naturalized yet. So the unauthorized immigrant category is showing 11 million. One part of my job was to make the estimates of those, how many are unauthorized in the country, and of course, we have to estimate those. And there may be more in the country, but I think that's a pretty good estimate. And then they're showing temporary lawful residents, and that's the categories of students, tech workers, people here under TPS. I also am listing some of the countries that are showing up most in temporary protective status recently. So there's 870,000. That's very high compared to historical numbers. Usually there's only about 400,000, but recently under the Biden administration, they did extend that. So you'll have high numbers from Venezuela and Haiti. And you see the numbers for DACA there is mostly Mexico. Okay, this is where I want to turn to legal immigration categories. So the fundamentals of U.S. immigration policy is 1, family reunification, 2, employment or business, and then 3, humanitarian. And that's really our core fundamentals. And what I'm showing here is data for the last 10 years on legal immigrants. About 1 million legal immigrants a year. The family-sponsored, or the family reunification category, is 65%. Employment-based is 16%. Humanitarian, about 12%. And then we have some other categories, which I'll get into. So You'll see also, I have whether they're limited or not. There's always an attempt to put limitations on immigration, but you'll see that some of them are not limited at all. And one of the categories is immediate relatives of U.S. citizens. So these are people with close relationships to intending immigrants, spouses of U.S. citizens. Now you think of that, remember that spouses, it could be a native born too. And they can enter without limitation, and I think about 75% of that 464 come as spouses of U.S. citizens. It also includes children, unmarried, 18 or under of U.S. citizens, and parents of U.S. citizens. There's other categories where there's less close relationship, and for family-sponsored preferences, it's limited to $226,000 a year. The employment-based, that's limited to $140,000 a year. You say, Mike, there's $166,000 coming in. And what it is if we're not using up all the visas in one category, it slips to the next year. When this was set up, they called this, we're going to have a cap on immigration, but it's a pierceable cap. A pierceable cap. So there's really no cap at all. I mean, there's cap in certain categories, but overall immigration has been increasing over time. The one thing that is very unusual about the United States is the extent that we let people in under the family-based category. Most other countries have higher categories for employment-based. And we are very, very unusual. And so a lot of the talks about reform is what's the proper mix in these categories. Even under that employment base, where I'm showing 16%, half of those are family members of the people that are coming here to work. They're coming specifically because they have a job and they're performing that job. They were sponsored by a U.S. employer. So we have a very low percentage. And I think that most of the thought is that we probably should, as we'll talk about later, immigration is going to be a big part of our increase in our labor force. And if that's true, why not bring in people who are coming for certain job skills, like physicians, like nurses? I've really already talked about humanitarian, but let me talk a little bit about diversity. The diversity category started really in the 1980s, but this program was in 1990. And what it does is allows people from countries that don't traditionally bring immigrants to come into the United States. And this has really increased immigration from Africa. And the reason we needed a diversity program was that if you were not a relative, if you didn't have contacts here in the United States, there was no way to get here. Now, the way this works, just as I said, is diversity. It's a lottery. About 10 to 15 million people every year apply. So this shows you a little bit about the demand for immigration in the United States. And it's a lottery, and it does sound a little crazy that here in the United States we accept our immigrants based on a lottery. But that's the way it is. And there are calls to probably adopt this category in many of the recent proposals I've seen. But it's done some good, like I said. One of the things on the family-sponsored, one of the categories that we have are brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens. I don't know if any other country has that, where you can come here as an immigrant, naturalize, and then bring your brother or sister in the United States. We've heard, you might have heard of talks about chain migration, where somebody comes and then another person comes. Well, the number of people that come under this are limited, but what's happened now is there's a waiting list, about 6 million to 8 million people waiting to come under the family preferences. So there's people outside the United States that are waiting to come in, which is another example of sort of a broken system. Before we get into this, I just want to say that there was a study from people in Germany, Italy, Sweden, Britain, and the United States about their thoughts about immigrants and immigration and the facts. And in all countries, respondents greatly overestimate the total number of immigrants, think immigrants are culturally and religiously more distant from them, and are economically weaker, less educated, and more unemployed, and more reliant on and favored by government transfers than they really are. So it's not just the United States, it sort of seems to be part of our human nature. This doesn't mean there's not legitimate concerns about the impact of immigration. And I think the case in point is what we're facing right now is the US border and our asylum system, which again is part of our broken system that we have now. So this is a picture of the Darien Pass, and there's other pictures like this at the border, and when people see this, they see that we just do not have control of the system. And I think many people who favor legal immigration see this and they say, it's out of control. We've got to do something about it. They worry about the people who are trying to come legally. Remember those 6 million that are waiting? And then we've got people that are coming in and going across the border. So they want fairness as well. And so this was big in the recent election. And might have had an impact. So let's look at illegal immigration, or undocumented, or unauthorized, sorry. A bunch of different terms. You can see this is saying unauthorized in the chart. These data are a little bit old. The most recent data I have is showing about 11 million. There's a lag. There's 11 million undocumented persons in the United States. It could be higher because there's a lag in these estimates. We've seen increases at the border recently, so it possibly could be higher. The thing that's been interesting is that legal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, the number has been pretty steady. And when you look at it from Mexico, actually more Mexicans have been leaving this population than coming in. The other thing about this is that many of these people that have been here in unauthorized status have been here for more than 10 years. 2/3 of the people that are here in an undocumented status have been here more than 10 years. So they're really like a permanent population who may have children, may have married a US citizen. And one of the things that is always difficult is, and this may be coming up, depending on what happens in the next few years, is there's many mixed status families. So you could have US citizen children, and then you can have the parents that might be here illegally. So the one thing that really has changed since my time working in the Immigration Service is the nature of illegal immigration. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it was 95% Mexican male. It was seasonal. They were coming to work. I remember once I was at the border in December, and they were all going this way. They were all going back to Mexico. And that was just the way it was. They came, and if we did apprehend them, and I would say we were apprehending about 1 out of 3, what we did is we put them in a bus, and we brought them back to Mexico. And then some of them tried again the next day. So it was very simple. We didn't have to have a lot of detention space. We just brought them to Mexico. I don't know how effective it was because it was like a revolving door, but it really wasn't a permanent population. They were moving back and forth. It was more of a seasonal. We started building up our technology at the border. We increased the number of Border Patrol agents, and we made it harder to get in. I've been down there maybe 10 years ago, and I look at it and I see a wall, and I see we have many more agents, and it's much more difficult to get in. So the unintended consequence of this is now we have a permanent unauthorized population. So they're coming, and since they might not get in the next time, they're staying longer. So that was one of the unintended consequences. But the other thing that's changed is just the countries of origin. So this data is showing, they call it encounters. I used to call it apprehensions, but it's encounters now because people are actually turning themselves in to the Border Patrol. They're saying, arrest me so that they can apply for asylum. And you saw in 2018-19, people from northern Central America, which is El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, I think, or Honduras. And then the red, just recently, or the orange, is people from Haiti, Venezuela. Now, what happens when somebody from those countries get here? And also, it's more families. So now you've got a family. You've got to get somebody back to Venezuela or Haiti, where their government is, falling apart. And the best thing would be to detain them, but we don't have enough bed space for that. We have to make arrangements for them to leave. And many of them are applying for asylum. So we want to recognize the legitimate asylum claims, and the system is really getting overwhelmed. So I have to talk a little bit about asylum. I'll get to the bottom here. Really, there's 2.6 million people in the United States waiting for asylum right now. And there's two types of asylum. There's defensive asylum, where you're apprehended at the border or by authorities in Interior, and they apply for asylum through the immigration judges. And then there's affirmative asylum, and that is people voluntarily come to the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, to an asylum corps. And the backlogs are huge. It takes about 8 years to make a final decision. And the way we've set it up is that if we don't make a decision within 180 days, that person gets employment authorization, meaning they can work. So that's because it's such a backlog, and they can get work authorization. I think there is some fraud coming in across. People are coming because they know they can get work authorization, and it's just hurting the legitimate people that have a legitimate claim. And this is a state we're sort of in right now, and there's been a lot of talk about how to change asylum. The Biden administration did sort of go with some of the Trump policies because of so many people coming across the border. But it'll come up in the next few years. Okay, I'm going to go and switch to. Okay. Do immigrants have a negative effect on our economy? So this is really from the National Academy of Sciences, and they say immigrants are integral to the economic growth in the United States. And why are they saying that? So before I get to it, I'm looking around here. I didn't do a survey about who's retired and who's over 60. We're aging as a nation. We're aging as a nation. We have very low birth rates. So the number of older people that need to be supported by workers is growing. And this is the one thing that was different back in 1900. The ratio, or the percentage of retired workers to workers or retired people to workers was 8% back then. It's 29% now, and it's going to be 37% in 2040. So one of the most integral functions and why they're integral to our economy is that there are workers in the future. 100% of the net growth in our workforce is going to be through immigrants or their children. I was just putting some data together for Virginia, and I looked over the last 20 years. Nearly half of the growth in the Virginia workforce was due to immigration, not counting the children. Now, again, that's somewhat of a tricky use of numbers because I'm talking about net. So there's a lot of, natives that are going out of the workforce. But it's critical. So foreign-born are currently 18% of U.S. and Virginia's workforce, and it's going to grow. Our native workforce is actually declining. That's part of why it's so necessary. One thing I want to say about these studies, I do have trying to stick with data, and there's studies that go over time, so I didn't put in, but this area, immigrants are integral to our economic growth, and they talk about it over 75 years or period, and it's on average. So this is a study and showing on average, but any change in the economy, through automation, trade, any change in economic policy, there are people who are injured. So when immigrants do come in, high-tech workers, and you're somebody who also is a high-tech worker, there is a possibility that you could lose your job. And so that's part of what's going on here. I'm talking sort of in averages, so I want you to think there are people that are being injured in some way or losing their jobs. But also immigration is not a lump sum. It's not winners and losers. I mean, they come and they create jobs. As I said, they're 1 out of 7 in our population, so that's about 14%, but they're 22% of entrepreneurs. And that's sort of starting out the restaurants that we enjoy here in Northern Virginia, but also in high tech. 23% of our science and technology and engineering and math workers, so they're overrepresented. And 44.8% of the Fortune 500 countries companies were founded by immigrants or their children. So they have an impact, and they can in our capitalist society here. And then finally, the economy runs on consumers and workers, and they consume. So if we don't replace our population, if we decline, our economy will go down. Okay, do immigrants take the jobs of native workers or lower their wages? Well, here is what I was talking about. This is from the National Academy of Science. They say there's little impact, but they may affect the hours worked of teens and prior immigrants. What's the impact of immigration on the wages of natives? Well, it may negatively impact the wages of prior immigrants, again, and high school dropouts. I just had some statistics here. I'm going to read that 3/4 of voters say undocumented immigrants fill jobs citizens don't want. And I think this right there. Immigrants are complements rather than substitutes to native-born workers. So what do I mean by that? If you look at the education patterns, immigrants tend to be highly educated and at the lower end, not with a high school degree. So what they're doing is they're coming and they're working in jobs that U.S. workers don't want, in some cases, picking our crops, milking our cows, and they're also filling in job gaps, like I said, physicians, nurses, and things like that. So, and also, you just allow you to spend job productively and you hire somebody to do other things. So generally the economists will say that right now they do add, they don't necessarily compete in all cases, but that's not true for everybody. So if you're a recent immigrant or you have just a high school degree, you may be impacted by immigration. And so you might have a different thought about it compared to somebody who has a college degree. Do immigrants use more in government programs than they pay in taxes? So the fiscal impacts of immigrants are generally positive at the federal level, but negative at the state and local level. So it isn't distributed evenly. I talked about this before, that the immigrants' children are generally very positive. But one of the big costs here is the schools. So at the state and local area, we have schools. We do educate all children. We don't ask what their status is. The thought is that they're our future workers. We need to get them educated. And there's uneven patterns across the country because of the residence patterns. In your handout in the back, I'm not going to be discussing it, but we have patterns of residence. And there's been traditional states. Virginia's actually rising. We were 25th in immigration back in 1960. Now we're 10th. We're sort of increasing. But there's also pockets of immigrants are going to areas where they haven't been, and they're smaller rural areas where they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the practice of the schools and doing ESL and things like that. And so it does cause conflict. And that's part of what happened in Springfield, Ohio. It was a large increase. Do immigrants commit crimes and increase the U.S. crime rate? It's difficult to get data here, but the evidence consistently indicates that immigrants have lower crime rate than natives. There was a Texas study where they're following immigrants over time, and they find the incarceration rate is 60% lower for immigrants than natives. And I've always been looking at this data. If you look at counties that have a high proportion of immigrants, they're always the lowest in crime rates. But why is this? In part, if you were an undocumented immigrant, are you going to commit a crime and be deported? So part of it could be because they're just very careful. Another part of it could be because they don't want to report crimes against them. And this is maybe something that's going to be talked about next week if you talk about policing. There's different ways that various police departments work with this, because some police departments will report an immigrant to ICE, DHS. And what that does is it creates fear within the community. They don't report crimes, and they are victims of crime. I think Fairfax County says we're just going to listen, they want people to report crimes. It's for public safety purposes. But it's pretty, again, it's not great data, but it's the best we have shows in almost every case that they have lower crime rates. Do immigrants commit voter fraud? No. You can see this. It's illegal for them to vote already. I mean, and then there's different, and some from the Cato, even from Heritage, they looked at 1 billion lawfully cast ballots and found maybe 100 examples of non-citizens voting. It's not going to affect an election. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is the case of Springfield, Ohio. So mobility is really an economic benefit of immigrants. They tend to go where the jobs are. So they're filling in where the jobs are and areas of economic opportunity. And then what happens is there's successful immigrants that go to an area and they say, with their social networks, they call back and, hey, there's jobs here. Then more come. I think in Springfield, they even were recruiting. I don't know if the city was, but the employers were recruiting, saying, hey, bring people here. But the resulting influx can cause strains on the local governments. And then tensions could rise due to cultural differences between newcomers and residents. And I think that's something we've seen throughout our history. I made this point before, but the Haitians that are in Springfield, many of them are here under TPS, so they are legal. But again, it does cause strains. And Well, it looks like we're past 4 p.m. But we're entering a new time with a new president, and the border and asylum will be high on the agenda. I doubt that there'll be changes in legal immigration reform because you always got to show you've got control of illegal immigration before you change legal immigration. But that's what's in store for us over the next couple of years. So thank you very much, and open to questions if we have time. I don't know.
So thank you very much, Mike. That was really informative. I'm sure we've all learned a lot. We will do 5 to 10 minutes of questions, and I've heard that Mike is willing to stick around afterwards if people do have more questions. So we have a center, in the center aisle, we have a microphone. If you have a question and you would like to raise it there, you can simply move to the aisle. If you would like to ask a question from your seat, please just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. Please.
Okay, hi, I'm Fazia Dean, and I'm glad to be here. I love the stats. As a lawyer, I just eating that up. My question is this. On one of the slides, you mentioned, do immigrants have a negative effect on our economy? But whether it's negative or positive, this is my question. You mentioned some good things, like immigrants are doing farming work, healthcare. Mm-hmm. And you didn't mention military. I'm from a military family. Do you have any stats on that? Mm-hmm. And I have a second question.
Do I have
anything about immigrants in our military service?
I mean, there are lots of immigrants in our military, and I don't have any data on that right now. But and I know there's special programs because in some cases we've had people that were here undocumented actually got in the military, and there's ways for them to become a permanent resident from that. And so there is, a tradition of immigrants serving in our military. And that's one of the key jobs that they're doing.
Yeah, thank you.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, and I just had a comment on one of your third to last slide, where do immigrants commit crimes? And I also sit on a committee called Police Civilian Review Panel, and all the cases, I've been on it for 2 years, and I haven't had any case that came from an immigrant yet. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Proves our point here, huh? Yes.
Having a career in the military, and I'm retired. I remember in the, oh, I'm sorry, you need a mic?
It's coming.
My voice, you need a mic? My first number I'm going to sing. I remember that after the war, World War II, I was a child, so I can't, but we had we had an agreement with the Philippine government that a certain number of Filipinos could come into the Navy, but they had to serve rather menial tasks. And in 1970, that changed. All rates opened up, and we got a large number of medical doctors that came in from the Philippines, coming in as enlisted men and then eventually becoming accepted as doctors. And I don't know if that program is still going or not. I don't know if we still have an agreement with the Philippine government.
So there is a program for Filipino war veterans, and many of them stayed in the Philippines, but they can become a U.S. citizen even though they're in the Philippines because of their war service. And the benefit of that is, remember the chain migration example. So if they're a citizen, then they can sponsor their children that might want to come to the Philippines. But that program's still running.
Just to share one of the things that's happening. Our nephew and his family live in a rural area outside of Richmond, Virginia. Mm-hmm. And they need, I think they're Hispanic workers to work on the farms. They're really needed,
Yes.
but the community doesn't really like that diversity. So they don't hire enough English as a second language teachers. So my nephew's wife is teaching English as a second language, and she's given an impossible number of students to teach.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi, my name's Troy. I am a retired Army officer as well. I recently graduated from George Mason, still taking classes. Some of the classes I'm taking are public health and climate change. And you kind of hinted to it at the end where you believe that Congress and the President will not necessarily address immigration until they demonstrate that they've got a handle on illegal immigration. My specific question is related to climate change itself. There will become portions of the earth that are uninhabitable, there's no potable water and so on, which are going to force migration around. Where do you see U.S. immigration policy related to that?
Well, I mentioned the temporary protected status category, and that specifically talks about climate disasters. So it's meant to be temporary, but I think it's sort of like, how can I answer this? I don't see them addressing legal immigration right now, but we know that that's going to be, immigration researchers have been thinking about this since the 1990s, that's going to be just causing immigration. And part of what we're seeing now is caused by climate. It's not measurable necessarily. So part of those forces at our border right now are probably due to, the farming's drying up and things like that and where they are. So we know there's a pressure. And I know the military is very concerned about it because it's not only countries competing for resources, it's going to be the workers, the people have to live, they're going to be competing to go where they can survive. So that's going to create more pressure. But how we resolve that, I'm not sure.
Hi, my name is Robin. During the recent election, leading up to our recent election, the issue of the impact of immigrants on housing was kind of brought up front and center in some of the debates. And I just wondered if you have any insights, any data about the impact of immigrants, and particularly undocumented immigrants, on the current housing crisis in the U.S.
I don't have any specific. I've read some of the articles, but I think the one thing I point out is that something like 38% of the construction laborers in the United States are immigrants. So they're building the houses. If part of the solution is to build more homes, they would be a needed worker in that category. But I don't have any data about how it's impacting it. Just the anecdotal information that you're talking about.
Terry, we have a question over here.
Hi, Mike.
Hi.
I just recently read in the Washington Post that the next administration is planning to continue the separation of families at the border. I never ever heard the end of what happened the last time that was done. So do you have any information about what will continue happening or what had happened with the separation of families?
Okay. So when President Biden came in, he ended that policy and created a program to try, because some people were still separated. And I think I don't remember the statistic, but something like 80, 90%, they did reunite them with their parent. But there's still some that are here that haven't been reunited. It's a very difficult problem, and I don't know what's going to happen coming up, but it's very difficult because we have mixed status families too, and not just those that are apprehended, but if they're doing raids and things like that. It's mixed status families, and it's just somewhat heartbreaking. And if family reunification is our main goal in the United States, this doesn't seem like it's following that priority.
Thank you, Mike. So unfortunately, we are out of time for questions, but as I said, Mike's going to stick around. So if you didn't get to ask your question, there will be time after we're over. Judith is now going to share some instructions with us on the next step.
Thank you to Mike and Shelley and all of you. We are going to at least have our small group discussions until 5 and maybe a little bit after 5 for people that can stay. So we really want to use as much time as possible to have our small group discussions. Since we won't reassemble as a whole group, I want to just take a really quick opportunity on behalf of ICD, again, to thank Mike for a really wonderful presentation. And also what you don't realize, the rest of you in the group, that he has really gone above and beyond in helping us to plan this whole program, really working with us to shape it, so we really appreciate that. And thanks to Pastor Shelley Poe and Little River United Church of Christ for generously hosting these events. To members of the ICD Board of Directors, its Education Committee and Working Group, especially Terry Reuter, who led this effort for this program, and many thanks to Geneva Pope, Adina Friedman, and all of the facilitators who are going to be helping us in the next part of this program. Please watch for an evaluation survey via email, probably tomorrow or the day after for sure. Take a few moments, please, to respond to us. Your feedback is really very valuable to us. As you checked in today, you were assigned to a group. The number and location are found on the colored dot that's on your badge. So it'll have a number at the top, which is your group number, and underneath it says something like choir, which is the choir room, or social, the social hall. There's a room 7 and a room 8. As you leave here, you'll be assisted in finding where those places are. There's a facilitator that's been assigned to each of those discussion groups. As we noted earlier, we are discussing a topic that can be sensitive and emotional. We may find ourselves in significant disagreement with others in the group. That's not a bad thing. It's an opportunity for a meaningful conversation, provided we keep in mind a few simple ground rules, and I'll run through them very quickly, and your facilitators will help with this. The most important is to listen actively. Don't think about what you're going to say next, but focus on the person who's speaking. Pay attention to the details and the underlying feelings of what's being shared. Be respectful, both when you're listening and when you're choosing your own words when it's your turn to speak. Maintain an attitude of curiosity and open-mindedness. Speak from your own experience with a perspective that starts with I and not they. Be sincere, open, brief in your comments. Embrace risk by openly sharing your own feelings and being sensitive to those of others. And create a safe space together by committing to maintain confidentiality of what's being shared. Finally, please be aware that we may use photos from this event for promotional purposes. We're assuming that no one has any problem with that, but if you do, please see someone, if there's still someone at the check-in desk, or you can see me, let me know if you don't want to use any of your pictures on our website or other things. No problem with that. So now to get to your group locations, as you go out and leave the sanctuary, you'll see that there are groups of chairs set up in the social hall and the choir room, and people will help you to get to your rooms, and we hope you'll have great discussions. Thank you again, everyone, for coming.